Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast, where foreign aid partners connect to learn about key funding trends and market insight. The podcast is co-hosted by Aid Connect Data, the pipeline and market intel software for USAID partnering, and Connected International, the leading USAID partnering support consulting firm. Now, here's your host, Mike Shanley.
Welcome to the Aid Market Podcast. Very excited today to have Sarah Rose as our guest. She is the Senior Advisor for Localization at USAID in the Office of the Administrator. Prior to that, she worked at the USAID mission in Mozambique. And previous to that was a policy fellow at the Center for Global Development and also worked at the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Sarah, thank you for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
So let's get right into it. Localization and locally led development. Could you start by framing how you and your colleagues at USAID see those terms and what they mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that question. Because localization really at its heart is a reform process, right? It's a way of shifting how we work at USAID in order to be able to really think about how to put local actors in the lead, to elevate local priorities and local knowledge, and to ensure local accountability and feedback, and how we are able to strengthen local systems as part of that as well. This is really important because we've known for a long time that local leadership and ownership of goals and processes are really known to be key ingredients for effectiveness and for sustainability. But it's also important to think about how to make the aid system more equitable, right? With greater inclusion of the people and the communities that our work affects. But I want to talk about this word, right? Localization is an interesting word, and we use localization to really talk about that reform process. There's another term that we use a lot, which is around locally led development. And this is really about that condition, right? In which local actors, are able to set their own agendas. They can develop solutions, they can bring their capacities, their leadership, and their resources to bear to really make those solutions a reality. And I just want to highlight that this is a condition that can exist everywhere, and it can exist with or without donor funding. And so when we're talking about localization, what we're talking about is the steps and the actions and the efforts that we as a funding partner can really undertake to help our work support and enable locally led development.
Great, thank you. And over the last few decades, we've had in the US administrations from both political parties, they've prioritized localization, maybe different versions of that. How have you and your team and your colleagues at USAID, how does this localization initiative differ from the past ones, maybe like USAID Forward, and how have you been able to learn from those past initiatives as you all designed and implemented this priority?
So I like this question a whole lot because it points out something that is very important, which is that this is not new, right? As an international community, we have been talking about this for decades, right? Country ownership, so to speak, was a key theme, back in the 2004 Paris Declaration on aid effectiveness. And as you point out, Mike, local ownership has really been a key part of USAID's vision, right? In some ways, since its very early days, but with some more focused initiatives over the last, decade plus. But there are some things that are very different about where we are now, and I just will highlight a couple of them. So first is around the why, right? Like the nature of the imperative. So as I mentioned, earlier, we pursue localization for two reasons. Again, first, because again, our experience shows that, local leadership and ownership of goals and processes are important for effectiveness and for sustainability, but also because we need to grapple with some of the elements of the aid system that have excluded or been accessible to many of the people and communities that aid work affects. And there has really been a growing global embrace of thinking about, diversifying partnerships, thinking about more equity, thinking about more inclusion, thinking about more accessibility. And this has really contributed to a widespread consensus that we do need to change the business of aid. And I think as a global community, we've made really important strides over the last 10 years to think about how to center, these issues in our discussions and our decision making as well. So I think the second sort of, core difference, right, is that, because we've been seeking to advance localization goals, like in various different kinds of ways for some time, is that, we have a lot more lessons that we can draw from. And one of the key lessons is that we need to think about how to frame our localization goals more broadly. And this means that, in the past, as you pointed out, we had local solutions back in the early 2010s, which focused on channeling more funding directly to local partners. In efforts like that, the emphasis on direct local awards was seen as, the main way to advance localization and the main way to track progress. But the way we're conceptualizing this now, really recognizing that it's really about shifting power, right? And this recognizes that the possibility to exercise influence over how development happens, right, for your organization, for your community, for your country, this is what's at the heart of locally led development. And of course, control of resources is a very important aspect of shifting power. So directly funding local organizations is a key goal, and that remains an important element of what it is that we're trying to do. But we also know that there are opportunities to advance local ownership and shift power across all of the ways that we might engage with local actors, right? Including whether or not they are working directly with USAID, whether they might be a sub-partner to an international partner, whether they are communities that are affected by USAID, whether they're participants in the USAID program. There are all kinds of ways that we can think about shifting power. And local communities and local actors can exercise power when they do things like set the agenda, make decisions about what projects will look like, and have accountability and feedback during those processes as well. Another key lesson that we've learned, though, is also that we need to integrate this locally led lens across our whole portfolio, really to think about it as a way of doing business. And again, in the past, we've had a number of localization specific initiatives, right? We have Local Works, we have the New Partnerships Initiative, and these are really useful catalysts and learning labs, but localization ultimately needs to be a core way of doing our work as opposed to sort of a standalone initiative. So that's kind of where we've been and where we are now. But I also just want to flag that, there has been a lot of continuity on this focus of the importance of locally led development. And again, I think that reflects a lot of, consensus or convergence around the importance of these efforts. But it's also going to be a continued learning process. And I think that that's going to continue to evolve.
And as you and your team are implementing this and with the local partners globally, are you also thinking in terms of how future administrations will learn from your team's experience and how they can continue to build off and maybe maintain that continuity in the localization agenda?
Absolutely. And I think everything that, we are doing now, we want to be able to understand, how that is affecting, our progress towards our broader goals. And I hope I'll have the opportunity to talk about some of the steps that we've been taking to try to, again, work in more locally led ways and reduce barriers to partnership and things like that as well. But in addition to just, taking these steps, we need to be able to think about, well, what does that mean when that happens? And what else does this need to look like? And what are the continued barriers that people face when trying to think about working in locally led ways or creating, stronger partnerships with a broader diversity of local actors as well?
Yes, we'll definitely get into that. Let's go next to measuring success and then your accomplishments. Can you talk a bit about how your team set out to measure the success of the localization work?
Yes. So at USAID, we currently have 2 agency-wide targets to help us track our progress towards our localization goals and to really hold ourselves to account for making progress. So as I just noted again, right, I just want to reiterate this because it's so important. Localization is about, centering local actors and elevating local leadership in our work. And again, there can be a lot of ways to do this. But one of those ways, of course, is to channel resources directly to those organizations, those firms, governments, right, that are positioned to drive change in their communities and their countries and their regions. And so one of our targets is about who we fund, right? And so we have a goal of channeling 1/4 of our funding directly to local partners by the end of fiscal year 2025. And we've made some progress, right? In FY22 and FY23, we channeled about 10% of our funding to local partners, right? And this is quite a bit higher than the 6% of funding that was going to local partners on average over the past decade. But as you can see, we have a lot further to go to reach our goal. One of the things that we've also seen, and I will just make a quick plug too for our new fiscal year 2023 localization progress report that we just put out a couple of weeks ago. It's on our website. You can find it at usaid.gov/localization, and you should be able to find it there. But one of the things that we also noted that, while we have about 10% of our funding that's been going to local partners, we've also been able to increase the number of new awards that are going to local partners, as well as just increase the number of local partners that we're working with over the past 3 years. And so we see that as an accomplishment as well. But I also want to pivot too, because, as I mentioned before, control of resources, it's an important form of power, right? Again, but there are a lot of other ways that local actors can exercise power, again, by thinking about how they bring their knowledge, their capacities, their leadership to bear, towards solutions that we work towards with our development and humanitarian programming. And so we also need to focus on how we work, right? How we create space for local actors to really exercise those kinds of power. And so we have a second target, and it's equally important, and it looks at local leadership of USAID programs. And the target is that we want the majority of our programs, at least 50% of our programs, to be locally led by 2030 in terms of thinking about, design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and learning as well. And one of the important things about this target is that, again, we can look across the many ways that we might engage local actors in our programs, not just when we partner with them directly. And so this target is a little bit less straightforward to measure, right? Measuring dollars spent is sort of intuitive enough, but capturing local leadership has been a new endeavor for USAID. And we have begun to track, the extent to which our programs, again, all of our programs, right, utilize, a set of good practices, right, that create space for local leadership. And so we're starting to track things like how and when and how often we use things like co-creation or participatory monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes, or use accountability and feedback mechanisms. We piloted a measure that looks at these things on about half of our programs just last year. And we found that, many USAID programs do incorporate, at least a couple of these good practices. But the pilot exercise was also a good opportunity to really reflect on how we're seeking to measure local leadership and think about how we can raise our ambition, both to improve our sort of fidelity to the concept of what it means to have local leadership, and also in terms of how we measure this goal. And so we'll have some changes that are coming to that, which we're eager to talk to folks about over the next couple of months when we get that out. I also want to highlight too that targets alone, they don't drive our progress, right? Targets are really important. They're a great accountability mechanism. And again, it's important for us to be transparent about what our progress looks like. But it's not this alone that's going to get us there. And so I also wanted to highlight, some of the things that we've really been doing to help sort of underpin future progress, right? And so over the last, year plus, right, we've really sought to pursue just a wide range of efforts to help us, move towards this goal of more locally led development and humanitarian response. And really, to make progress on a reform effort of this magnitude, there is a wide range of changes, right, that are really needed across a range of different spheres, things like policy and practice and culture, and also things like regulatory changes, right, that can be supportive as well. So if I may, I'd love to highlight just a couple of these. And one of them, sort of a foundational piece, is thinking about what do our policies look like, right? And so we have developed new policies on things like how do we approach local capacity strengthening. This is something that's integrated into a lot of our awards. Again, awards that are managed by international partners, awards that are managed by local partners as well. But how can we approach local capacity strengthening in a way that is principled and in a way that is demand-driven, that reflects both the capacities as well as the interests of the organization that's being served? We're also looking at how do we shift our acquisitions and assistance practices to better enable inclusive and locally led development and to diversify our partner base. We have new policies that emphasize things like the importance of utilizing local knowledge, and also policies that highlight the importance of and the expectation that, across program planning, design, implementation, and measurement, that staff should be integrating local leadership and local priorities into how they're thinking about that work. And also, we're about to release a new policy that outlines our path ahead for ensuring USAID's humanitarian response efforts are locally led as well, because there are some specific kinds of needs, constraints, and opportunities in the humanitarian sphere that's a little bit different than development, and requires that sort of special attention about how to think about local leadership under those circumstances. We've also sought to develop a lot more tools, resources, trainings, guidance, things that can help support staff to work in more locally led ways. Some of these things include, having institutional support mechanisms that can help USAID staff to, improve local partnerships, can help strengthen the capability of partners to work with USAID. We've done new trainings on things like participatory program design, and things like guidance on, how do we apply locally led principles to specific sectors, because it looks different in different kinds of places, things like that as well. One of our goals, though, of course, is a key goal is about, enhancing and expanding direct local partnerships. And so some of the things that we have done have been really targeted at that particular goal. And in particular, thinking about how can we lower barriers to entry for local partners. And we're working on doing this through a number of different approaches, including things like, increased and better targeted outreach. Importantly, thinking about how we can expand the use of local languages in our acquisitions and assistance processes. Over the last few months, we have developed a new agency-wide translation program, which provides missions at no cost to them, services that can help translate acquisitions and assistance, documents into multiple different kinds of languages. Because, this seems like a basic thing, but it's just so critical for accessibility, and it's something that we've haven't done in a systematic way before. We've also, revised our guidance on how we do pre-award assessments for local partners, so we can make the process more flexible and more tailorable, and think about, instead of having it be sort of a pass-fail approach, thinking about how we can get to a more constructive relationship with that partner. I also want to just flag that USAID is also focused on being a better partner, right? Like when we actually do, when we are able to partner directly with some of these local organizations and firms, et cetera, how can we partner better with them, right? And so some of the things that we're doing are, expanding the use of mechanisms that have lower compliance burdens, right? That pay for results rather than focusing on some of the key compliance requirements. Thinking about how we can take steps to really help support partners to ensure their full cost recovery when they work with us. And we've also been, of course, encouraging staff to reduce reporting burdens as well. And it's these kinds of steps, ultimately, that are going to help underpin, future progress towards those targets, but more broadly as well when we're talking about locally led development.
Thank you, Sarah. And we recently had your colleague, Jamie Rogers, the new chief acquisition officer, on. He also talked about exploring ways that you and your colleagues can use new tech and AI innovations to potentially streamline some of these points. Also, he comes from NASA, so we talked about potentially lessons learned from other federal government agencies on procurement and things that may be able to be applied to USAID. So great. With that, then now let's move to the practicality part of it. What are some challenges that you and your team have faced or identified in trying to implement some of these very ambitious localization activities and priorities?
Yeah, of course, that's a great question too. I think one of the fundamental things that we think about is that when you're talking about something like localization, which is really about broader sort of systemic, organizational, and culture shifts, is that they take time, right? And that they need this mix of both patience and impatience, right? Patience in that, it takes time for some of these things to really transform, but yet impatience in terms of thinking about, the imperative and why we need to move forward on this now. One of the things, that can be a challenge is really around staffing, right? Staffing is so critical to effectively, working with partners in locally led ways, right? It takes more staff time to listen, right? To co-create, to translate documents, to expand communications channels. And when you have, new local partners that haven't worked with USAID before, to help guide both prospective and current partners sort of on some of those processes as well. We've made a big hiring push, right? But we need continued investment in staff. And I think another angle of this too is really around, it's around just communications and sort of within organization communications as well, right? USAID is a big agency that has, something like 13,000 people in its workforce. And we're doing a lot to try to support learning and peer exchange in a lot of different kinds of ways. But this can also come slowly too, right? Internalization of information is not something that happens on an overnight basis. It happens sort of gradually as people are able to, share, expand, and spread knowledge. Because again, we talk about, the goals of localization. We talk about some of these available tools and resources. But again, it just takes some time and some staying power to think about how we continue to make sure that those kinds of things are shared as well, and how we continue to make sure that we continue to listen, right, on the kinds of barriers that both staff face as well as local communities and local partners face when working with USAID.
And Sarah, obviously this is an initiative exclusive to USAID and the global aid donor, the multilaterals, the bilaterals, the foundation space. How do you see where USAID sits into that global donor ecosystem? And are there lessons learned, coordination of either other donors learning, maybe, on this podcast, listening to you and learning from you? Are there ways that you all can effectively engage with and learn from them? Can you talk a little bit about how that relationship works, USAID's relationship with some of those other major global aid donors?
Yeah, that's a really important question. USAID, of course, is one of the world's biggest funding partners, right? So we want to make sure that we are able to use that position, right, and our partnerships and our convening power to really help catalyze this broader shift toward more locally led development. But really, we see that USAID is part of this, growing global movement, right, of actors who really recognize the importance of locally led development and humanitarian assistance, and who want to make changes to how they work to really better achieve those goals. One really important example of this is the donor statement on locally led development. USAID worked together with the Development Agency of Norway to spearhead this new commitment. And it's now been endorsed by 20 other bilateral funders, as well as 26 philanthropic foundations as well. And what the statement does is that, through this statement, endorsers really commit to, these broad goals of thinking about how to shift and share power, how to channel high quality funding, as directly as possible to local actors. And of course, how to advocate, publicly for increased efforts to continue to advance locally led development, to really continue this drumbeat. And I think this evidence of, this joint commitment is really important because, individually, none of us has all the answers or all the tools. And so it's really critical to make sure that we're working toward common goals and to learn from one another as we go as well. But what I really want to say here too is that I need to be clear that I think our role, again, in the broader international ecosystem is to listen, right? There are and there have been for some time, right, global South-based leaders and groups and movements and advocates who are really powerfully advocating for a shift to more locally led and more inclusive approaches. And so they need to continue to drive how these commitments and these changes that we're all talking about need to look as well.
And with that, let's shift to the USAID partners, both the established implementing partners, US small businesses, European partners, other new partners globally. How do you see them fitting into USAID's localization agenda?
I like the way you frame that question. The question is, how do they fit into localization? Because that actually says it all, right? Because there is a key point, is that there is a role for everyone, right, in advancing locally led development. The idea is that, to be successful in this, what we have to do is be able to leverage and to be able to build upon, all of the different types of, expertise, resources, networks, skills, right, of all of the different kinds of actors that exist in a development or humanitarian ecosystem. And then we do so in a way that really creates or supports the conditions for local actors to exercise leadership. And we can create those conditions by focusing on relationships, right? What do relationships look like that are based on listening and trust and mutuality and respect? So concretely, what does that look like, right? USAID's, US-based or international implementing partners, they have played and they will continue to play key roles in advancing locally led development. And the kinds of things that this can look like are, co-creating or facilitating co-creation of activity design or activity implementation with local actors. It can be about how they can collaborate and learn and adapt with local stakeholders throughout program implementation. One of the key valuable propositions that a lot of international, actors bring to the table is integration of local actors into international networks and markets. And many international partners, they engage in really valuable capacity strengthening, which we have heard can be seen as very valuable, especially when it's structured, in terms of things like mentoring and coaching of local organizations and building on their existing strengths and supporting them to achieve their goals, right? Partners can emphasize locally led monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes, thinking about what are locally defined measures of success or how are there participatory approaches that we can use towards some of these goals. And I think fundamentally, the issue is just around being deliberate and being intentional about how partners engage local actors just at each step of the process. And another piece, and I mentioned this before, but I think it's important to mention too, is that, there is a lot that implementing partners or USAID sort of, traditional or international implementing partners, including, like US small businesses, for instance, there's a lot that they can do to help strengthen USAID's capacity to pursue its localization goals. Again, like I've said before, when you work in locally led ways, including working with partners who are new to USAID, as many local partners are, it can take time, right, for things like outreach and guidance. It can take specialized skills, right, like facilitation skills and language skills and things like that. And so what we see is around the world, implementing partners are bringing their skills and their resources and expertise to bear to really help bolster USAID's own capacity by supporting some of these functions as well.
And just to re-ask another way, Sarah, because we get this question a lot, is there are the established partners, the U.S. small businesses, the European partners, the international partners, the new partners, is there an important role for them to play in USAID's localization agenda?
Yes, absolutely. Again, there is a role for everybody in USAID's localization agenda. Again, because it's really about how do we think about creating the conditions in which local actors, local communities, local governments, right, are able to exercise their agency and their decision-making power. And again, in some cases that can be done through direct local partnerships, but in a lot of cases it can be done through, partnerships that we have through international actors as well. And one of the things that I want to highlight too, and I think this is important, is that we have to focus on that part. This has to be a big part of what USAID is talking about when we talk about localization. I mean, if we look at our direct local funding goal, we have about 10% of our funding going directly to local partners right now. We have a goal of 25%, right? Even if we achieve that goal, 75% of our funding is still going to be going through international or US-based implementing partners. And so if we're really serious about, advancing locally led development, it's that big chunk of partnerships that we're talking about and how to think about engaging in a locally led way in those that ends up being really important as well.
Yeah, so I'm hearing it's an important role for those established partners and the new partners to think through the programs that they give direct funding on. How can they continue to highlight and share the stories of their locally led development, how they're designing and implementing the programs in a locally led way. Now going bigger picture to USAID's, obviously it's U.S. government agency, key piece of the foreign policy. One of the models is the 3Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development. And that's one of the core pillars of U.S. foreign policy. Localization is an initiative to improve the effectiveness, the efficiency of aid, achieve greater impact. How do you see USAID's role fitting into the broader U.S. government foreign policy context?
Yeah, of course. It's a really important question. I think the way to think about this is, thinking about localization as part of a broader sort of, set of criteria, right? So the investments that USAID is going to support, needs to meet multiple criteria, right? One is to think about supporting sustained change, that those investments, of course, must respond to local aspirations for change. Again, local priorities. This is tied to this idea that local ownership and local leadership is critical for effectiveness and for sustainability. But our investments also have to remain consistent with U.S. values and establish programmatic and procurement practices as well. And so, all of our investments must also do things like reinforce democratic practices, thinking about advancing diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, strengthening health systems, being responsive to climate change, fostering economic growth, as well as supporting other foreign policy and national security priorities. And so when we promote these values, that can really help support, our broader national security as well. And moreover, again, going back to what I highlighted before, if we're talking about, investments that we hope will be effective in advancing these priorities, thinking about locally led development is the best way to ensure that our investments, or to maximize the possibility that our investments will really help support some of these lasting development issues, or really strengthen local systems to do so. That ends up being a really important criteria or context as well.
Thank you. Going next, I think it's always interesting to hear stories, anecdotes about to really bring home the idea of what localization is. Could you share any stories or success stories of where you feel localization has really worked, or something that you feel really embodies the vision of the USAID's locally led development and localization initiative?
Yes, but there's so many of these. So let me talk about one that actually ties a little bit to the question you just asked. And I'll talk a little bit about Centro America Local. So in 2021, USAID launched this initiative called Centro America Local, which was designed to help address, in locally led ways, some of the challenges that can influence decisions by individuals living in El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to migrate to the United States. Right. And so again, this is also a foreign policy priority of the US. But I'm going to talk a little bit about, how this program has really, taken off and had a lot of success. So what we see is that, between 2021, right, when the program was launched, and 2023, in just a couple of years, USAID has provided more than $140 million to nearly 30 local organizations and enterprises in these three countries in Northern and Central America. Again, that's El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. If we look at FY23 data, we see that 21% of USAID's funding in these three countries went directly to local actors. And this is an increase from just 3% in 2020, the year before Centro America Local began. And I think, a wide range of efforts by the three missions have really driven this progress. They have, made efforts to really expand outreach to local actors. And that's been a really important component of this work, including specific outreach to, indigenous and women-led organizations as well. And I think this is really important and something I want to underscore. So if I may take a quick sidebar for a minute here. We talk a lot about, local actors, right? But there's a lot of heterogeneity and diversity like within that category of local. And it's really important to think about, how we take an inclusive development approach to some of our localization lenses. Because, there is a risk, right, in implementing, a localization effort, right, that if doing this, in the absence of a lens that also looks at inclusion can potentially risk sort of, exacerbating or reinforcing some of the, inequities that may exist in a particular place as well. And so again, I just want to flag that, the missions in Central America who are pursuing this greater outreach really had a focus on, thinking about how they can make sure that they are reaching out to and bringing in indigenous and women-led organizations into this conversation as well. They've also looked at how to dismantle some of the barriers to working with USAID to help facilitate new partnerships. And so one of the things, I'll just point to an example in Guatemala, right, that the USAID mission did there. So what they did is they used an approach in which they outlined their broad objectives, right? And then they solicited proposals from local organizations and restricted to local organizations for how they would respond to them. And this is a change, rather. This was not the mission prescribing interventions, but it was setting out we have these kind of broad goals that we want to achieve. What would you do? As part of this process too, what they did is they translated the entire procurement package into Spanish, and they did a lot of outreach campaigns around this approach, including in Spanish as well as indigenous languages as well. And then when it came down to the application process, the mission was able to use a phased approach, right? And this phased approach started with concept notes, right? That they could be submitted in either English or in Spanish. And this really opened the door a little bit more widely. So prospective partners didn't have to necessarily invest as much upfront, right, in a full-blown application before understanding the likelihood of being able to move forward. One of the other things I want to highlight too, because this really gets into that kind of that power shifting dynamic too, is that most of the programs with local partners that were part of Centro America Local have been co-created either with local partners or with local communities. And these co-creation processes have been really important because they have led to better alignment with local priorities, as well as less risk of duplication of other efforts as well. And this seems to have mattered, right? There were recently some interviews that were done with some of the local partners who have been working under the Centro America Local program. And they had said that, the co-creation processes that they did with USAID helped it feel more like a real partnership than some of their prior experiences as well.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. One thing we like to do on the podcast is just help partners better understand USAID, how you and your staff day-to-day operate so they can understand how they can best support that. You have the unique experience of having worked both in a USAID mission overseas as well as in the DC headquarters. Could you talk a little bit about maybe the differences in those two roles at USAID, maybe again, from the context of helping partners better understand when they're meeting with the Mozambique mission? What are the USAID staff they're thinking? What are their priorities when they're talking to the DC headquarters? What are their priorities there? And then, of course, touching on localization and is there a different angle or priority or activity maybe within there? Again, when the partners are engaging with both the missions overseas as opposed to the DC headquarters?
Yeah, it's a great question because, USAID in many ways is a very decentralized organization, and missions, create their own strategies, right, for what they will be focusing on. You can actually, see their strategies for what individual missions are looking at by going to the Country Development and Cooperation Strategies page at USAID, and that has the different missions, goals, approaches, what they're funding, et cetera, as well. It's an interesting question about the role of Washington versus missions in terms of localization in particular. One of the things, that we see in our data, and this is unsurprising, right, is that, missions tend to be the ones that are more able to form these direct relationships, with local partners. And again, that's not surprising, right? They are the ones who are there in country. They're able to form relationships with local partners. They have staff who have language skills. They have staff who are have continuity at missions over many years to be able to think about how to develop these kinds of relationships. And so in many ways missions are well suited towards thinking about how to expand and diversify these partnerships with local actors in particular. Washington plays a different kind of role, right? Washington can look regionally. They can support broader objectives. They can look at sort of cross-country kinds of initiatives as well. But that doesn't mean that Washington isn't part of sort of how USAID thinks about approaching localization or locally led development. And I think, again, this ties back to some of the things that we were talking about earlier. When thinking about, if Washington is, tending to manage awards that are more centralized, maybe that are larger and cross-country, et cetera, they may be less likely to be awarded to a local organization. Although we do have some Washington-based awards that are locally managed or primed, if you will. But most of Washington's awards are tend to go through international implementing partners. And so then the question is, how can some of those awards be structured in ways that can help sort of focus on that, expectation around local leadership and locally led development as being a core part of that. this is a little bit of a separate point, but I do want to raise it too, because I think it's important. One of the things that, you asked about is, what about partners who are interested in understanding more about working with USAID? And you couched the question as mission versus Washington. But one of the things that we're really excited about is a new tool, like a new portal that we have online called workwithusaid.gov. And that's a tool for anybody, right? For either partners who are based in the United States or partners who are based around the world, to really be able to understand, what it means to work with USAID, what like different kinds of requirements there might be, different kinds of opportunities. This website is now very recently translated into 4 languages. So the entire website is available in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. And we're really excited that we've seen a lot more activity on the website in some of these languages as well. And so we're excited about what that means in terms of reaching out to people and reaching people where they are as well. And workwithusaid.gov also has directories that can be really helpful, right? For any partner to register and to be able to make connections with one another and with USAID in terms of thinking about, well, what sector are you engaged in? What geographic region are you engaged in? And there's a specific directory even that looks for opportunities for sub-partnerships as well, that can help partners who may be looking to sub-award or subcontract some of their award to particular organizations who have certain capacities potentially in the country where they're working, and how to help facilitate some of those connections as well. So I would encourage folks to check that website out.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Now looking forward, as you look through the end of the year, what are both the things that you are excited about in localization, and then what are the things you're going to be looking at to see what you all have built so far? Is that successful? What are those data points or anecdotes or things that you'll be looking for to see? How can you continue to adjust course, or are you on the right course? Yes, if you could talk a little bit about looking forward, what you'll be looking for, and then of course what you're excited about.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I'm excited about. So some of the resources and the tools and even some of the policies, right, that I mentioned earlier when we were talking about, how do we think about how do we view our success, right, so far. Some of them are still pretty new, right? That they've only been, released in the last, year or so, or a couple of months. And I think these are going to be really important tools to help facilitate, again, our future progress towards advancing more locally led development. So what I'm really excited about is seeing how some of these end up taking hold. And then also, I think as you highlighted, really continuing to learn about how they're taking hold and where we can, shift and go from there. One of the things that I'm also really excited about, again, looking forward, is and this is going to get a little bit in the weeds, but weeds end up being really important and consequential for how things work. But just recently, the White House's Office of Management and Budget released some new updates to the federal regulations that govern how federal agencies do their assistance awards, right? And assistance awards, this is like grants and cooperative agreements. Those are often the tools that we use to work with local partners. And they've just released some updates that I think will be, really supportive of some of our localization goals again. And the updates will be implemented later on this fall. I think October 1st is when the updates are expected to be up. But, some of these things are, offering more explicit permissions for, doing assistance practices in languages other than English. Again, we've seen this be really helpful and really important. It's also thinking about how we can, simplify notices of funding opportunity, right? And using more plain language around these notices of funding opportunity as well. And another piece, and again, this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but it's really important, is around indirect cost recovery, right? So indirect cost recovery can help support some core functions of an organization that maybe are hard to attribute very specifically to an individual sort of development project that is being funded. Yet these processes end up being very important for sort of the overall organizational health, right? That underpins the success of some of those projects as well. A lot of established partners with USAID negotiate with USAID a sort of an indirect cost rate agreement, but new partners and many local partners, they don't have these agreements. And so many, rely on what we call the de minimis rate, and that's been 10%. So they were allowed to capture 10%, right, in indirect cost recovery. But the new federal regulations allow an increase of this indirect cost recovery rate to 15%. So I think that, again, it sounds weedy, but it's really important in terms of thinking about how to really make sure that we can fully compensate local partners, for the work that they will do. As well as also, help, maintain their strength and their organizational viability and well-being as well.
Let me emphasize from our experience on the outside, working with organizations that are new to USAID, helping them understand how to best partner with USAID. It is in the weeds that is the barriers to entry. It's great. We do health system strengthening in Uganda. All right, we're a great fit. Oh, we can only recover 10%, or here's some other regulations like, or how can we, how do we even get engaged? Oh, great. Here's this co-creation workshop. We can attend this. So I think that, the advice, the input from the outside is that those really are a big deal. Those things that you and your team, because I think it both practically makes it easier to work with USAID, but also signals to the market that, and to partners globally, that you all really are implementing these important changes to make it easier for local organizations and new partners to work with USAID. So just sharing that, thank you on behalf of the partners globally as well, and saying that I completely agree that that is very important. And that's really where I think the progress is made.
I appreciate your welcomeness of the weeds. I assumed that on an aid market podcast that maybe we could get into some of those details, but they are really important. So thank you.
That's what we're here for. Yeah. Any other examples or stories that you want to share? Again, on what you're excited about, or some examples of what you really of localization where you see it working well.
Yeah, I think, again, there's a lot of these. Maybe I'll just highlight, just recently, Administrator Power took a trip to Morocco, where she was able to talk to the mission there about their localization goals and locally led development as well. And this was a really, helpful trip as well, because I think it was able to underscore a couple of things, right? One, our mission in Morocco has been recognized as a leader, in thinking about localization and locally led development, because they've been able to, one, nearly double the percentage of funding going to local organizations over the past couple of years, but also because they just think about locally led as kind of a North Star, right? When they're thinking about, what it is that they're doing. And so whether a program is going to be, led by a local partner, or whether it's going to be led by an international implementing partner, the idea is thinking about, well, what does local leadership look like in this? And local leadership, again, includes some of those communities. It also includes government, right? To make sure that, anything that the mission is doing is really aligned with some of those, government priorities, community priorities as well, that can help drive what this looks like. And, some of their programs, again, I think I'll just, highlight one in particular. They were able to use a local partner, for instance, to do a listening tour, right? To really reach out to, some of the more marginalized, more disadvantaged, communities too, to really, ask those communities, well, what do you want Morocco's participation in this sort of, governance approach and agenda that they were working towards to really look like? And so I think this is a really great combination of a couple of things. Like, one, it talks about, again, the utility of sometimes using local partners, like when able to do so. But it also talks about thinking about, how do you get broader local voice into the agenda setting process, and how do you also get that local voice from a more diverse and inclusive set of communities as well? And so I think that's an example that's really worth highlighting, but there's a lot more too.
Great, Sarah. Could you maybe share we'd like to, as we get close to wrapping up, talk about the so what? So as organizations listen to this, again, the purpose of the podcast is be a platform for these important conversations on development, how we can increase impact more efficiently, deliver development value. What are some of the key takeaways that you would like partners to walk away with from this conversation?
That's a great question. So I think I will highlight 4 things. And I'll try to be brief because they're supposed to be takeaways. And so let's be pithy here. The first is that, locally led development is really important for greater effectiveness, for greater sustainability, and importantly, for greater equity in development and humanitarian work. The second thing I want to highlight, and again, I've said this a couple of times, but just to underscore that there are a lot of ways to advance locally led development. It's not one thing. And the mix of things, again, like whether that's direct awards to local partners, whether it's co-creation with local stakeholders, integration of local knowledge, creating local accountability mechanisms, direct partnerships with government, or something else. This mix is going to vary from place to place, depending on context. Context is really important when we're thinking about, what does it mean to be locally led? The third is that, again, there is a role for everyone in advancing locally led development. It's about how do we bring all of the various actors, strengths, skills, expertise, resources to bear in creating spaces for local actors to, take the lead as well. And then fourth, and this goes back to one of your early questions, Mike, is that, this is a continuation of a reform effort that really began years ago, right? And like any institutional reform, this is a long-term change process. We have learned and we have evolved, and we will, I hope, continue to do so. But I think that the staying power of this effort, right, across years, across administrations, and in one form or another, to me, it's really a signal of its centrality, right, to doing good development and humanitarian work.
Great. Well, Sarah, anything else you'd like to add or share with our audience on what you and your team are doing on localization?
No, I just want to underscore too that, again, this is an evolving conversation. And one of the things I said before, and I'll say it again, is that listening is so important. And this has to remain important to what we do, and listening to all sorts of actors, right? We need to listen to, international implementing partners who talk about how they see their role in elevating locally led development and how USAID can help enable that or draw that out. And we also, very important and crucially, need to continue to be able to listen to, those local communities, stakeholders, governments, et cetera, on how they want this to continue to look, right? Again, it's a process that takes a little while, and we are committed to continuing it. But as we do so, we need to be able to ensure that, we are, again, I think, this is a word that we use a lot at USAID, is about collaborating, learning, and adapting. So how can we find those opportunities to make sure that we are able to collaborate with and continue to learn from, again, many of these, groups that are advocating from the Global South, who are advocating and encouraging and providing us advice and recommendations on how to do locally led development better. It'll also be about listening to local partners and local communities, like in the countries where we work, about how they have seen, some of these actions take shape and where they hope to see it going forward. And then how do we learn from and adapt from what we hear from that as well? The way that we move forward, I think, is by listening and by learning. And we've done so, over several years. But again, I think one of the questions that you asked earlier was, do you think you're on the right path? And I think that, we are on a path forward, but the path is going to continue to be shown to us as we go. And we need to do all we can to help clear that path too, right? To make it easier for us all to move in this direction.
Well, Sarah, thank you for the critical work you and your colleagues globally at USAID do every day, the exceptional partners you work with, and appreciate you taking some time to join us on the Aid Market podcast today to share that important work. And we certainly look forward to staying in touch as the localization agenda continues to evolve and to support your team's important work however we can.
Thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you for tuning in to the Aid Market podcast. If you enjoyed today's show, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and connect with Mike Shanley on LinkedIn to stay updated on the latest USAID funding trends.